Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ram Paudel, a researcher here with NREL. Thank you for joining us this on-demand webinar, a part of the wind workforce development effort here at NREL. Today, we are here with yet another webinar of this series. Our presenter is Paul Denholm, and topic is Grid Services from Modern Wind Turbines, Engineering and Economics. Paul Denholm is a principal energy analyst here with NREL. His research focus is on studying impact of wind and solar power onto the power grid and understanding what technology might be deployed in order to increase the contribution of wind and solar, renewable energy in general. This webinar is being recorded. It should be available in NREL Learning Channel in about 2 weeks. Wind energy is an industry that is ripe with innovation. We want to bring contemporary research and the innovation into lecture halls across the country. Education tools and curricula to support university education are part of NREL Wind Workforce Development effort. This NREL project is targeted to wind application centers, as well as university offering wind and renewable energy courses. Recently, pioneers of the industry have come up with a review article in Science titled Grand Challenge in Science of Wind Energy. This webinar relates more to the third grand challenge, system science for integration of wind power plants into future electricity grid. Paul Denholm will be sharing us with some of his findings over his 20 years long career, taking examples from ISOs across USA.
Power generated by renewable energy must support the stability, reliability, and operational needs of electric grid on time scale ranging from microseconds to days and weeks for planning purpose. Innovation in both engineering and economics are very important aspects of grid integration of renewable energy. I believe Paul will also touch upon the current market structure in the USA, as well as the innovative market mechanism to sustain and maintain the growing contribution of renewable energy in the national power grid. And interdisciplinary research can indeed address this grand challenge in wind energy science. A lot of new and exciting opportunities ahead. We'll get a chance to learn more from Paul shortly. We'll try to make this webinar as interactive as possible. Please use chat features so that you can submit your question to us. Please go to chat and type your question there. You have option of asking question to everyone or a specific person. Please direct question to everyone. My colleague Liz Gills will organize those questions and present to Paul after he is done with his slides. In any case, please keep your question coming. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A in this hour-long webinar. With that, let me turn it over to Paul. Paul, here you go.
Okay, this is Paul Denholm, great. I've got confirmation that my slides are online, so we'll go ahead and start talking about today's topic, which is grid services from wind turbines. So we're going to be basically talking about the various services that the grid needs and how wind turbines can provide those services. Today's talk is focused on the continental U.S., so these are the different regions. And Ram, if you want to go ahead and mute folks online, we're getting some feedback here. So today's talk will be focusing on these regions of the U.S., essentially the various market regions in the U.S. and some of the non-market regions. This presentation will be available, so if kind of the numbers don't matter that much, we're just trying to give you a flavor for the regions that we'll be talking about today. We're going to be providing a review of the various grid services that are required by the grid. And kind of we'll just kind of go through these one by one, but essentially we'll be focusing largely on operating reserves and other essential reliability services. That'll be a key element that we talk about here. So one of the things is that when we talk about the various services that are required by the grid and are provided to the grid, there's lots of different names for these services. So if these don't exactly match what you're familiar with, keep in mind that most of the ISO, the independent system operator regions, the market regions of the U.S. use different names for a lot of these categories. So everybody's familiar with kind of the energy and capacity needs of the system. A big focus we'll be talking about is what are now called essential reliability services. These used to be kind of categorized generally as ancillary services. Essential reliability services is kind of a newer term, and we can further break these down into things like operating reserves as a subcategory of essential reliability services. But starting with the overall capacity and energy, these are the main services required by the grid, essentially the large amount of capacity needed to meet peak demand. Most of the regions of the U.S. right now are well within the planning reserve margin requirements. So essentially, the amount of capacity needed plus additional reserve requirement needed to make sure that you can reliably meet demand during peak periods. Most of those regions are well within that requirement, but as other systems retire, as other power plants retire, if there is eventually load growth again, perhaps due to electric vehicles, there may be a need for new capacity. I'm going to skip over the prices and really get into what we're talking about here today, which is these essential reliability services. Again, it's important to emphasize the fact that these have different terms. So especially when people talk about regulation or frequency regulation, you just need to be really careful to make sure that you understand what people are talking about. Same things with things like spinning reserves. Some people will talk about spinning reserves as contingency reserves. Other times they'll be talking them as frequency responsive reserves. So you just have to be really careful about understanding when people use these terms. A good place to start whenever you're in doubt is the NERC glossary. If you just kind of Google NERC glossary, that's always kind of my go-to source to kind of at least have a starting point as far as what some of these terms mean. But again, most of the regions of the U.S. use these terms slightly differently. So one of the key elements of operating reserves or essential reliability services is operating reserves. Essentially, this is the capacity to respond to a variety of unforeseen events, contingencies, outages, and the characteristics of operating reserves can be really distinguished by these three factors, which is how much do you need, measured in capacity, how fast do you need to respond, how quickly will an event happen, how quickly do you need to be able to increase output, and how long does the response need to be. And again, there's no uniform definition for these various reserve products, but they all have these characteristics as defined by these three factors in terms of how much, how fast, and how long. So the how much, what sets the size of the reserve requirement? It depends on what the type of reserve being considered. So there are things like event type reserves, such as the largest contingency, or what happens when a large power plant goes down? How can you respond? How much capacity do you need online to respond to that? And this doesn't have anything to do with wind or solar. These are typically large thermal plants, either nuclear power plants or large coal plants. They can also be the largest transmission line. So these event type reserves are really not driven by wind or solar. Now, normal uncertainty, the response to the unscheduled variations, this can be from variable generation resources such as solar, wind, or variations in load. So these are the factors that set the size of the reserve event. Now, when we talk about a contingency event, contingency events are part of a large sequence of things happen when there's a large contingency. So when there is a coal plant or a nuclear plant or a large transmission line that trips out, there's a sequence of events that happen that respond to that. And the reason why we have these multiple services is due to a variety of kind of history as well as economics. But essentially, the sequence is reserves that respond to frequency or changes in frequency. So that's frequency responsive reserves. They detect the changes in frequency that occur when there's a contingency event. And then there's a series of follow-up reserves that are deployed to respond to that. And we'll go in a little bit more detail into each one of these and eventually talk about how wind can provide some of these services. There's a bunch of different ways of looking at this. Sometimes people talk about this in terms of the time scales of the response, ranging from inertial response in the milliseconds type time frame, all the way out to economic dispatch that occurs in minutes to hours. And again, we'll go into all these. I just wanted to kind of just demonstrate the fact that there are a series of reserves and multiple time scales involved here. one of the other important things about reserves is they incur costs, and this sometimes can be a little bit confusing because people talk about costs of reserves in market regions, and there's kind of no real underlying explanation given for in market regions for why these costs occur. So what we're really talking about here is a concept called opportunity costs. And opportunity costs are essentially represent the fact that when you're providing reserves, you're holding capacity back that could have otherwise been providing energy services. And so that opportunity cost can be reflected in how you have to change the dispatch, hold back a little bit of energy from some units in order to be able to increase their output. So that cost can be calculated and is calculated in various market regions, and that results in a price for providing these reserves, generally measured in units of capacity over some time period. So if you're holding back 10 megawatts of capacity to provide reserves, there'll be a price for that 10 megawatts of capacity for an hour or some other time period. In addition to the cost of kind of holding that capacity back, there's also a movement cost, or when you vary the output from a power plant, that can incur additional costs as well. So these costs are kind of inherent to the system and produce the value to a generator that can provide these operating reserves. So starting through the kind of the sequence of those reserves, thinking back to that kind of sequence of events that happens following a contingency event, the first thing that happens is frequency responsive reserves. And this is traditionally two services, inertia response and primary frequency response. And primary frequency response is now being talked about in terms of even subcategories such as fast frequency response. Outside of Texas, these are not market products. These are basically provided for free by generators, and so people are kind of grumbling about that to a certain extent. And so a lot of places are looking at changing these to market products. So inertial response is actually one of the most complicated of them. And normally you'd want to start with something simple and talk about something a little bit more complicated later. But unfortunately, or for whatever reason, inertia is the first thing that happens. Inertial response is the first thing that happens when there's something like a contingency event. So we kind of have to start here. But inertial response is essentially reflects the stored kinetic energy in spinning generators, and that stored energy can respond instantly to a contingency event. So when we've got a simplified grid here, we've got 30 generators, and we've got 30,000 megawatts of supply and 30,000 megawatts of demand. So in kind of steady state operation, we'd be matching supply and demand. But what happens when one of those big generators trips out? Think about your TV. Your TV doesn't really know about what's going on in the grid. It's just sucking power out of the grid at a constant rate. If you were to disconnect one of the big generators providing energy, your TV, all those appliances would still be sucking all that demand out of the grid. So you'd have an imbalance of, you'd have 30,000 megawatts of demand, but you've only now got 29,000 megawatts of supply. Where does that energy come from, that imbalance? Again, all of these devices, they don't see what's going on in the grid. They're just sucking that constant amount of energy out of the grid. So that energy actually has to come from somewhere, and it does. It comes from the inherent stored kinetic energy of the system. So the generators will still actually provide 30,000 megawatts of energy, of power. It's just that missing 1,000 megawatts will be automatically withdrawn from that stored kinetic energy, inertia. Now that will of course result in a decline in frequency, and we can't have that last very, very long. There's only so much stored energy in those generators. So what inertia response is really doing is it's giving us those critical, crucial seconds, and we really are only talking about a couple of seconds here, for other systems to respond. So essentially what will happen is, as we're sucking energy out of those generators, they'll start to slow down, and other systems in place will detect that slowdown of frequency and do something else. So inertia gives us those first couple of seconds, and depending on how big those generators are, how many of them are, the size of the contingency, we'll have fewer or more seconds. Again, we're really only talking about a few seconds here. That's how much time we have to respond and provide the next line of defense against these big events, which is primary frequency response or governor response. And these are the devices that detect that frequency. So if you go to an old-time train museum or engine museum or something like that, you'll see something like is in this picture. It's called a flyball governor, and it's a device that spins around and actually mechanically detects the frequency of the device. So these things are spinning around, and if you spin the governor faster, the balls will spread apart, and they're connected to a lever, which is connected to a valve on the generator. We don't use flyball governors anymore, but they were very reliable, and they all work. And what they do is they detect changes in frequency and open or close valves to increase or decrease the flow of water or steam into the turbine. And so inertia response and primary frequency response historically have worked better to resist the initial change in frequency and then respond to that change in frequency quickly within a few seconds to increase power to the system and respond to changes in frequency and replace the capacity that we lost when that big generator tripped offline. Now, we don't have a whole lot of standards or market requirements for inertial response. ERCOT is really the only place that is really studying and making changes to how they operate their system to make sure that there's a sufficient amount of frequency response. The eastern and western grids are so much larger, there really isn't any kind of big concerns yet. So it's really only been Inertia or ERCOT that's been studying this issue, because as you add more wind to the grid, since wind does not inherently provide inertia, and we'll talk more about this, ERCOT has had to do some other things to able to maintain frequency response. Now, primary frequency response or governor response, there are NERC requirements or NERC standards for the amount of capacity needed. So you can kind of look at and now start getting a feel for the total amount of primary frequency response needed in each one of these regions. So in the east, you need a total of about 4,000 megawatts of primary frequency response. In the west, about 2,500, and ERCOT around 1,500 megawatts. These are NERC's minimum standards. ERCOT is doing some different things, but this starts to give you an idea of how much frequency response is needed. And these numbers are actually entirely driven by the largest single event that is likely to happen. So in Texas in the west, these are a large nuclear plant, or actually a pair of nuclear plants, tandem nuclear plants, if those were to trip offline. And in the east, it's a large transmission, basically a large transmission interconnection. So if any of one of these trip offline, you want that really quick response. And so this is how much the minimum requirements to respond to those events. The next type of operating reserve or essential reliability service that people talk about is something called regulating reserves. Some people talk about this, some people use the term frequency regulation. It gets a little bit confusing because this is not frequency responsive reserve. This is a longer duration reserve. It's still seconds that is used to regulate frequency on longer timescales. Again, it gets a little, the terminology overlap is a little unfortunate, but there's nothing I can do about that. So again, this one would be regulating reserves, or sometimes called frequency regulation. This is a market product in all the ISO RTO regions, and it is essentially designed to respond to normal variations, normal random variations in supply and demand. So these are not really designed to respond to big contingency events. This is essentially what happens when you flip on the light bulb. When you flip your switch on a light and you've got 100 watts of almost instantaneous increase in demand, or when you decrease the, better example, of course, is something like an air conditioner, which has, at least, hundreds of watts or maybe a few kilowatts. But even, a steel mill or large industrial appliances, you may have an instantaneous change of, even a few tens of megawatts. And so in order to quickly respond to those kind of normal random variations in demand, all market regions and all non-market regions, all regions of the country create or keep online regulating reserves to respond to this variation. And you can see on this graph, the blue curve corresponds to the left y-axis, and that's kind of the load picking up in the early part of the day and kind of response to normal increases in demand. The red line, which is actually superimposed in green on top of the blue, represents that regulation. You can see that it's a fairly small amount. So you've got the load increasing from 3,600 megawatts to 4,000 megawatts, whereas regulation, that random signal on top of that, is 20, 30, 40 megawatts. So it's relatively small, but it is a really important part of responding to those variations in demand. This is a little bit messy, and again, you'll have access to this. Essentially, what this is kind of giving you a flavor for how much of these services are needed in each region. So just picking California, for instance, you can look at the top row and see that the requirement for regulation is about 300 megawatts. So basically, the California Independent System Operator maintains about 300 megawatts of headroom in their system to quickly increase and decrease output. Now, their average demand, their peak demand is somewhere in the order of 55,000 megawatts. Average is a lot less than that, 30,000 megawatts or something. But still, you can see that it's a relatively small fraction of the total demand on the system. So, for instance, the fraction of the annual peak demand, less than 1%. So again, these are relatively small amounts of capacity needed in the system. So nationally, we're talking right around 6,000 megawatts or 6 gigawatts of capacity needed to respond to these random variations in demand. The right-hand side shows you the prices for these services, and that's got these funny units of dollars per megawatt dash hour, or the cost of holding 1 megawatt of capacity for an hour. That's not energy, that's capacity for an hour. And these are some of the most valuable services. You are having to move your unit. You're having to ramp up and down. These prices are less than energy, but again, you're not being paid for energy here. Any additional energy you provide while providing the service, you're paid for. So this is literally just a capacity payment that you're receiving for these services. Okay, the next type of service that we're talking about here is spinning contingency reserves, or these are reserves that are activated following a contingency event. So again, we've got that primary frequency response that acts within a few seconds to respond, but then we need something to replace that. So I've got this big event, my governors respond, increase outputs from the generator, but then you need something else to replace that, because if I don't restore my primary frequency response, then if something else happens, the lights might go out. So the sequence of events is the primary frequency response increases output, but then I call on my spinning contingency reserves, which are generators that are operating at part load and able to ramp up. Now, the total amount held in each of these regions is based on its single largest hazard or single largest contingency. So again, this is typically a large nuclear or coal plant. You can see the ERCOT requirement of 2,600 megawatts. That's about the same as the primary frequency response. Again, that's that biggest, largest region. Nationally, it's about 12,000 megawatts of capacity needed. Again, these are online generators that are able to respond quickly. Prices are substantially lower than regulation reserves because these are units that are basically just kind of sitting there and doing nothing. So you're providing some energy from a partially loaded generator, but you're not constantly responding to variations in random demand like you are with regulating reserves. So prices on spinning contingency reserves are substantially lower. The next service is non-spinning contingency reserves, and these are essentially plants that are typically offline and able to be quickly started. So these would be gas turbines that can that within 10 minutes can start. And again, these prices are even less than contingency reserves because this is basically just idle capacity sitting there and doing nothing and waiting for something bad to happen. A fairly new requirement or a fairly new reserve product is this ramping reserve requirement. And this is essentially a response to the increased deployment of wind and solar on the grid. So it used to be that the set of reserve products that I talked about were sufficient to provide everything we needed. With the introduction of wind and solar, it became recognized that we probably need something to respond to the random variations in wind and solar. But regulation reserves isn't quite the right product because those are designed to respond to really rapid changes in load. So again, that industrial process that quickly switches on in a fraction of a second. Wind and solar variation doesn't happen that quickly. A wind turbine just doesn't all of a sudden stop stop producing, you'll get some gradual variation in output from the wind turbine as a result of a weather front moving in. And this is typically happening over minutes or so. So the idea behind a ramping or flexibility product is some kind of reserve product that can respond over multiple minutes and respond to unforeseen variations in demand. And so this is an emerging product. Only California and the Midwest so far have implemented this product to the regions of the country with the greatest deployment of wind and solar energy. So when we look at the total amount of reserve requirements needed nationally, you can look at the right-hand column, and that dot is basically showing you that we're talking about a few percent typically of the total capacity in the system is needed for reserve. So not a huge amount, but of course critically important for maintaining system reliability. So this is another way to look at it. So if you're trying to think about the future of the grid or what the grid needs now, it really is still the most important aspect of it is that capacity needed to serve energy. So that bottom blue column represents the capacity that's really there to kind of meet the day-to-day energy demands of the system, and those kind of little slices at the top are those reserve products. So again, a relatively small slice, but we're getting increasing attention to that as we explore new ways of integrating wind and solar and seeing what wind and solar can do to add in addition to the energy and capacity services it already provides. There are a number of other essential reliability services that we talk about. Two of the most important that people kind of talk about is black start and voltage support. Black start is essentially generation that's used for system restoration. So again, if all the power plants fail, you need something to start power plants. It's essentially like you need a car battery to start your car engine. Black start units are there to jumpstart the rest of the system. They provide the power needed to start larger power plants. And these are typically small diesel generators, some hydro units. There's not a whole lot needed, but of course it's really important. So people are talking about making sure that we maintain black start and considering the best way of doing this economically. Voltage support is another important service, and it's essentially needed to maintain the transmission system operating at the proper voltage. This is typically provided by conventional generators, but there's a lot of other ways to provide as well. So the differences between these services and the others is these are local products. Typically, you need them in certain locations, and for that reason, they don't typically lend themselves too well to market products. So they're usually acquired on a cost of service basis. So an entity decides what the kind of the value is, and then pays people to provide those services. So if we can have people mute. So in terms of the relative system costs, this gives you an idea in two regions what the kind of the relative contribution for the different services. You can see that in terms of energy and capacity, again, this is the vast majority of costs, and plus transmission, of course. When you look at operating reserves, these are typically small amounts. So, for instance, you've got black start in both regions here. Black start in ISO New England, kind of towards the bottom, well under 1%, 0.1%, similar type number in PJM. So again, these are small numbers, but they're not zero, and people are interested in, as we transition from potentially fossil-based system or synchronous generator-based system to more renewables, is there a role to play for renewable energy in providing some of these services? So that's the real question: is what can wind do to provide various services in addition to energy and capacity? What changes might need to be made when we're designing wind turbines or operating wind turbines to provide these services? So in terms of energy and capacity, again, wind has been providing that. I think the biggest issue, of course, is what comes down to the capacity credit of wind. Essentially, it's providing lots of energy, but can it actually replace physical capacity? And most of the U.S. has been doing analysis of what's called the capacity credit of wind. Basically, if you've got 1 megawatt of wind, how many megawatts of kind of conventional thermal capacity could that potentially replace? And typically the answer is relatively small. So if you're installing wind without storage, which obviously is of greater interest, the ability of wind by itself to replace traditional thermal capacity is relatively low. Typically 10, 20, 30%. So again, that if you've got a 100 megawatt wind farm, you'd only expect to be able to replace maybe 20 or 30 megawatts of conventional capacity. So that's one of the reasons why folks are interested not only in storage, so you can shift the generation of wind to other periods, but seeing what other things that wind can do to increase its value to the system. So operating reserves for wind are one of those places where people are considering or actually have implemented the ability of wind to provide this. So wind was used to be that we would consider it as a must-take resource without the ability to kind of vary its output and control it and do interesting things with it. But it's now recognized that the output of a wind turbine can be very accurately controlled up to the amount allowed by the weather, and that's a really important part. So if you've got a wind turbine and the wind conditions are blowing such that it would produce 1 megawatt, you can actually control the output of that wind turbine anywhere between 0 and 1 megawatts, and you can do it at a very rapid rate. So this chart is essentially showing the 3 parameters we talked about: how much, how fast, and how long, and compares conventional generators to wind. And wind does have some advantages here. It can operate over its entire range of output. And it can have ramp rates that are much higher than a conventional generator. So for 2 of those elements of providing reserves, wind can actually be superior to a thermal or hydro plant. Of course, the issue is that lower capacity credit and the continued availability. So wind can increase its output, but it can only do that for as long as the wind continues to blow. So we have to be really careful about deciding which reserves it can provide, but continue to take advantage of that really rapid rate and large range of operation. So to provide this, we do need to do something called pre-curtail or downward dispatch the wind plant. So that blue curve represents what the wind output of a turbine might look like over some period of time over an hour. So it starts high, is increasing and then going down. But if we want to actually be able to provide an upward reserve, be able to provide more energy, we have to downward dispatch or reduce the output. So if that wind availability is 1 megawatt on that individual turbine, we might back the turbine down to 500 kilowatts, and that way we can provide 500 kilowatts of upward reserve. And that pre-curtailment, while it's incurring a cost of lost energy, it's also providing that benefit of upward capacity. And so that trade-off between energy and capacity is something that we need to consider when providing benefits to the grid. Now, one thing that we need to talk about whenever we talk about wind is some of these terms that people throw around. So wind can provide really rapid response, and we talked about frequency response. One of the things that we talk about now is something called fast frequency response. So we used to talk about primary frequency response or governor response. So I showed you that picture of that flyball governor attached to a thermal generator and a bunch of mechanical valves and systems. Those take a while to respond. Now, a while in these terms, we're still talking about fractions of seconds or seconds. We're not talking about minutes here. We're talking about fractions of seconds. But that's still a long time when we're talking about inertial response. Wind, because it can respond so much quicker because it's electronically controlled, it can actually operate faster. Still getting some feedback, so if we can mute. So one of the important things is making sure that we understand when people talk about frequency response and fast frequency response. Fast frequency response is something like primary frequency response, but with a faster rate of response, and that means it's potentially more valuable. We can, in addition to pre-curtailing wind energy, we can actually also extract some of the stored kinetic energy in a wind turbine for a short period of time. So wind turbines, like conventional synchronous generators, are rotating machines and have stored kinetic energy. So we've done tests here at NREL, but around a number of places in the U.S. and ERCOT has tested this. Quebec has been doing this for quite some time. They've actually deployed wind turbines that can very rapidly respond by extracting some of the stored kinetic energy from the wind turbine. So the combination of pre-curtailing the energy and extracting kinetic energy can pove essentially replace some of the conventional frequency response. So this is a simulation that was done here at NREL using computer models of the Western interconnection and doing some experiments of really high penetration of renewables, so like 80% types of penetrations of wind energy, and demonstrating that if you add a bunch of wind to the system and take all those conventional generators offline and lose all that inertia and frequency response, you may have trouble correcting the decline in frequency that results after a contingency event. And so that's that green line at the bottom. So essentially, if you don't use wind, if you don't take advantage of all these things that wind can do, you might have problems. But if you start doing, employing the ability of wind to provide frequency response, it can provide services as good, if not better, than from conventional generators. And so the blue line represents the change in frequency that results after one of these events. And it's a really good response. It's well above kind of the minimum standards needed. So again, using wind turbines to provide frequency response is an increasingly used thing. It's not super common in the U.S., but in places like Texas, they've started to do this, and it's actually now a requirement for new wind turbines sold in the U.S. So as we see more of these wind turbines deployed, we'll see more and more frequency response from wind. So this is a kind of a summary of some of the grid services and the potential opportunities for wind to provide those services. Many of these are market procured and compensated services, and in many of these places, wind can provide them. So technically, wind can pretty much do most of what conventional generators can do, with the big caveat that the wind has to be blowing at the time where you need that service. So wind can technically provide most of those services, but we're not seeing that yet. So the difference between the second and third columns in this chart is whether or not wind can technically provide the service by changing its output, and compared to what does wind actually provide that service. And you can see that while wind can technically provide most of those services, it has very limited provision of the services so far. There's a lot of places that they're not quite comfortable with it yet. So in some places, markets don't even allow wind to provide those services. So there needs to be more technical demonstration of wind providing these services. But I think as people get more comfortable with wind energy providing these services, we'll see some of those market rules change. So I know I went through that pretty quickly, but I wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for questions, and we can kind of review or discuss some of the issues if we'd like. So Ram, I'm not sure how we can do questions here, but to see what we can do.
Hello, this is Ram, and I have requested Dave Corbus to help on this Q&A session. And I request all the participants to unmute and ask questions directly to Paul.
Hey, Paul, this is Dave. I'll ask a question. When do you think we're going to see wind or solar become N-1 contingencies? I mean, we're getting these gigawatt plants going in places. Do we have any examples of that?
Yeah, we actually do. It's a great question. So in terms of interconnection-wide penetrations, we're unlikely to see that. So for it to become a interconnection-wide contingency, an entire farm would have to be larger than 2.5 gigawatts, and that would basically mean it would need to be connected to a single transmission line that's that size. So it's really unlikely that we're going to see that anytime in the near future. However, locally, we actually already do have some places where it's the single largest local contingency. So for instance, my local utility here, Xcel Energy in Colorado, now has a large wind farm that's connected to a transmission line. And there are times where that wind farm, the output of that wind farm is actually larger than their share of their largest coal plant. So there actually are times where that wind farm can be the single largest contingency. Now, one of the things that's really important about wind is you can think about, oh, that sounds really bad. If wind becomes the single largest contingency, then that means I need to hold that amount of spinning reserves, and that incurs costs. Well, you can compare the costs of the additional reserves to just simply curtailing the wind farm for that amount that is needed. So if you're struggling to provide a certain amount of contingency reserves, you can simply back off the wind farm, and that also means the wind farm is providing a fraction of its own contingency reserves. So just like a thermal generator, you could back it off. You can do the same thing with wind farms and mitigate any increase in reserves that occur due to that wind farm.
It's like wind participating in reserve sharing.
Absolutely.
That's But the Anschutz wind plant is like 2.5 gigawatts, so it might make a N-1 in the future if it ever gets built.
Yeah, and one of the things, of course, is to consider how many transmission lines are on that, because of course you're not going to, and that's one of the beauties of wind. You're never going to have all of those turbines go down all at once. Even if you have a high wind event, it's really unlikely that single farm will go down. It really comes down to the transmission line. So how many transmission lines is it connected to? Is it a single large DC line? Of course, then it does become the single largest contingency. And again, how often is that wind farm generating at full output? But yeah, I mean, those large wind farms that are on the books, they absolutely could become the largest contingency at some point. And again, that's one of the reasons why it's important to look at wind providing its own reserve services.
Dave, I can see one question from Bruce. Can you please explain that to Paul, or maybe Paul can see that directly?
Let's see. Let me see if I can bring that up here. Okay, yeah, I can see that question here. The question is, why would the price to not generate ever be more than to generate? The price to not generate. Yeah, so I think the question is, involves this idea of opportunity cost, and if you're holding up a reserve product, you have to compare the cost of energy for not generating that and comparing that to basically the cost of the reserve service, and it is very rare that the price of reserves is greater than the cost of energy, and typically you want to generate at full output. But one of the things that you can do with wind is, if there are very low prices, and this can manifest itself in negative prices, you can back off the wind turbine to either avoid the negative prices or provide that upward capacity. So in general, it's pretty rare that you'd prefer to provide reserves rather than provide energy. But again, as the penetration of wind and solar increases, there may be greater times where the energy is not really worth very much, so it may be more valuable to provide those upward reserves. So if that answered your question, but you can follow up, or always happy to follow up offline at a later time as well.
I have one quick question for Paul. What kind of innovative mechanism would you see in future coming, especially in order to support the variable renewable resources, Paul?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, can you be a little bit more specific in terms of, is it wind turbine design or market products or new reserve products? I mean, there's a lot of things going on right now. So
I'm especially interested in market products.
Yeah, so I think the places that there's the most action in markets are with the flexible ramping products and frequency response. So essentially, that's the combination of two things. For frequency response, it's just the recognition that you've got these generators that are providing the service and they're not being paid for it. And so there's been a lot of concern about generators actually removing governors or disabling governors, because basically when you've got an active governor, you're changing the output of the power plant frequently. That incurs wear and tear costs. So people can kind of complaining about that. So there's been a lot of discussion about how can we make that a market product. And that would just kind of level the playing field. I mean, that's not really as much about renewable energy as it is just improving the efficiency of markets. But that said, given the ability of wind and solar to really rapidly respond, I'd think that wind and solar could be a net benefit of that market change, because it just gives them another opportunity to provide services. The other thing is the flexible ramping product. It goes by different names, but that is a direct response to the increase of wind and solar. And again, it is recognizing the fact that there is some additional variability imposed by wind and solar. And we can talk about equity of different resources that provide and take away operating reserves, but there is an additional uncertainty and variability component created by wind and solar, and so a flexible ramping product should be a more efficient way of responding to that increased variability than regulating reserves. It'll be a lower cost service, especially because it's a slower responding service, so it should aid the efficiency in integrating wind and solar.
That's great. And one more question, like, is there some utility perspective constraining this kind of innovative market structure? Like, what is the utility perspective on this issue?
Sure, that's a great question, and you know, we've always seen a historical variation in utilities. We've seen some utilities that were quite progressive in innovation and adopting new ideas. We've seen a lot of others that have been resistant, and that can always be understood. I mean, utilities have this ultimate responsibility to keep the lights on, and playing around with new technologies and experimenting when it could hurt reliability has always been something that we have to be really careful about. But that said, we're definitely seeing a shift in attitude among most of the utilities in terms of their growing comfort with integrating larger amounts of renewable energy. You see, it's really interesting to see quotes from folks like SPP that are basically like, there isn't really a technical limit to how much wind and solar we can put on the grid. It really just comes down to economics. So I think while we're still seeing some regional variation, there is just an increasing awareness of the ability to increase wind and solar on a grid, and it'll still take a while. I think, till we see large-scale use of wind and solar to provide these services. But keep in mind that when you're providing primarily energy, it doesn't really matter as much that you're not providing these essential reliability services yet. What we just have to make sure that we do is we don't put in any kind of artificial constraints. And so this has been a challenge. If we see wind and solar creating challenges, we just have to make sure that at a minimum, we let wind and solar provide the opportunity to solve its own challenges. We don't want to do things where we say that you need to provide ramping reserves exclusively from thermal assets if wind and solar can provide it themselves. So that's always been my biggest concern, is making sure that wind and solar at a minimum can address any increased uncertainty and variability that it imposes on the system. Let it solve its own problems.
Paul, I can see one great question from follow-up question from Ken Starcher. Can you see on the chat room?
Sure. Yeah. In terms of penetration, modern utilities, it's very high. I mean, we've seen instantaneous penetration levels. I mean, ERCOT has hit close to 60% instantaneous penetration, and that's an interconnection-wide. SPP has hit those kinds of levels. My local utility here has hit 70+% instantaneous penetration. That's not, and that's not an interconnection. That's BA level penetration, but it still requires balancing. So these aren't levels that are contractual. People talk about getting 100% renewables or something. A lot of times those would be based on financial mechanisms that don't require technical balancing, but these kinds of penetrations that I'm talking about, especially in places like ERCOT's getting 60% instantaneous penetration. That's an interconnection-wide. They are providing all of their regulating reserves, all of their frequency response reserves, and maintaining a reliable system at those kinds of instantaneous penetration. So annual, of course, are lower than that, but you got to start with instantaneous penetration and kind of work your way from there. But yeah, I mean, people are talking about very high instantaneous penetrations. I mean, certainly there's been studies of systems that, especially in the West, approach 100% renewable penetration. But yeah, I mean, people are increasingly looking at very high penetrations throughout the U.S. So. And quite frankly, in response to Yeah, let me just finish this one. You know, it's funny. There's a kind of a tongue-in-cheek talk about Texas, but really, Texas, they are really leading a lot of these things. I mean, in terms of frequency response, providing services to wind turbines, studying alternatives to conventional inertia, ERCOT really is taking the lead. I mean, they're not the only folks that are doing it. SPP has been a real leader. Lots of places in the Midwest. Obviously, California is more about solar, but really, yeah, when you look at real pioneers here in the U.S. of wind, yeah, ERCOT's where it's at. So go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, I mean, just closer to home and Excel in our balancing area, the difference between energy penetration, which I don't know what 11, 12% wind annually, energy, and as Paul mentioned, 70% penetration with, you know, instantaneous power penetration or hourly power penetration. So it might be a low energy penetration, but you're going to get those really high max penetrations. And the other thing I'd add is Excel has been a leader because they've had the wind turbines on droop response for over 5 years now, I think.
Yep.
And require that.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things. Yeah, so ERCOT doing frequency response, Excel doing regulating reserves, so basically providing regulating reserves. So what Dave was talking about, you know, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people doing innovative things, and you know, one of the interesting advantages of a non-market region is Excel has a little bit more flexibility to try new things and doesn't have to go through the stakeholder process. So you know, seeing different levels of innovation. Some people going through creating new market products, others trying things in different regions. So again, one of the advantages of having different regions trying out new things, and then of course all learning from each other and helping the process. Other questions? We've got just a couple minutes.
I'm just curious, Paul, like how does this innovation in storage technology, especially the battery, lithium-ion battery technology, will fit into this equation? Like what you see coming in future?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with wind versus solar that's kind of unfortunate for wind is that wind, while it pairs with storage and there's some synergistic advantages, it's not quite as clean as it is with solar. Solar has that nice diurnal profile that works well with batteries. But as the prices of batteries comes down, especially as we transition, potentially moving from say something like a 4-hour battery to more like an 8-hour battery. Most of the deployments going in right now are 4 hours, but if you can get closer to an 8-hour duration battery, that would allow a greater amount of diurnal shifting and help the day to night problem that we often see with wind, with wind tending to blow more at night during those low load periods. So again, most of those instantaneous penetrations typically happen in the middle of the night, although Excel's recent record actually happened at 5 to 6 p.m. But most of the time you see one of those big wind records from Texas or from SPP, they're typically 4 in the morning. If we could get longer duration batteries, that would help that diurnal shifting and help the overgeneration problem, negative price problem, and just help integrate wind in general.
That's great. Are there any more questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly to Paul. Paul, looks like there is no more question. Thank you very much for the great presentation. And if you have a question, you can email to me and I'll pass that question to Paul or reach out to Paul directly. With that, looks like we are coming to close to an hour and we're gonna stop here. Thank you very much, and we'll process this video and come up with the recording in our learning channel in about 2 weeks. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, Dave, for facilitating Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.